My name is Pastor Terrell McTyer. I am your minister of New Church Strategies with New Church Ministry out of Indianapolis, Indiana. We're at the Disciple Center, and I just want to say thank you so much for this opportunity to be with you in this kind of peculiar way. If I had my preference, I would be right there in the beautiful state of Florida with you celebrating your regional assembly as I have always been able to do, but that's not possible right now. Nevertheless, thank you for this opportunity to serve and to talk to you about New Church Ministry and also just about growing disciples. Thank you to the committee, the Regional Assembly Committee, for this invitation to participate, as well as your amazing pastor, Pastor Betsy. Thank you so much, and we continue to just love on you, and thank you for the way in which you sacrificially give to this region and to the work of Jesus Christ. This morning we are together or afternoon, or whenever it is that you might be watching this, to talk about making disciples. And, you know, this is the thing that we're called to do as a church. It is our absolute duty to make disciples. And one of the greatest ways to do so is through starting new churches. Now, you might say you are not called to start a new church or to shepherd a new church, and that's perfectly okay, because there's many different ways to make disciples and vehicles through which one can do so. Starting new churches is way, revitalizing churches way, or just being out in your community and doing new things with new people, having faithful conversations about Christ is an awesome way to continue to be a part of making new disciples. But in our time together, I want you to think about a couple of things. For a long time, matter of fact, about 20 years, what we have been able to do is work on a specific goal that was set to us by our regional minister 20 years ago, Dick Helm, that encouraged us to do leadership development, be an anti-racist, pro-reconciling church, to also transform 1,000 congregations, and to start 1,000 churches 1,000 different ways. Here we are at the blink of an eye 20 years later, and we've done it. We've started 1,000 churches. We've revitalized thousands of churches, and we will continue to do this great work. Matter of fact, I'm happy to report that we exceeded the number of 1,000 churches. That's why I'm wearing this shirt that says 1,000 new churches and counting, because we have gone over that limit and we're not even out of the year 2020 yet. So Florida, congratulations for your contributions to this great feat. But the work is not done. We have so much more to do. And while the strategy of starting new churches was a noble one, when I look back at it, I kind of wondered if it also didn't have a hint of survivalism threaded through it. And so what I want to do is encourage us to not necessarily be so focused on ourselves, but I believe the Spirit is calling us to a time where we are more externally focused. And so that's why last year at the General Assembly, I put a charge towards the church to say that we will not necessarily focus on starting a certain X number of churches anymore, but more so focus on being external and doing so by making more disciples. Matter of fact, the Spirit has led us to charge us to make 1 million new disciples within a decade. So I want to talk to you about some of the things that you might need to do to think differently in order to feed into this idea and continue to support this idea of making new disciples, and how maybe your church or your congregation or your family or yourself might be able to help us to make more disciples. Matter of fact, if you have conversation, if you want to converse about this idea more, or maybe even have us to come to your congregation to say, how can we be a part of making more disciples? I'd like for you to shoot me an email at terrell@newchurchministry.org. That's Terrell, Terrell, or you can do info@newchurchministry.org, or you can go to newchurchministry.org and all my contact information is there, or talk to Betsy or Selena or anyone in your region, and they will be happy to connect you with me. You know, there was a time where the questions reflect a fair bit of ignorance of the meaning and the significance of disciple making, as well as a loss of the ability to even articulate what is involved, what is the end game or the result, how we should actually do this thing of disciple making. And I must admit that I find this ignorance pretty alarming, given that from any fair reading of the New Testament itself, discipleship and disciple making lay at the very heart of the church's gospel mandate into the world. Matter of fact, I believe that making disciples and a focus on doing so will solve the majority of our issues that we have in our church, from attendance issues to engagement or involvement issues, how to connect better with the community, how to draw young families, how to have better stewardship practices and gain more money. All of these things can be solved by focusing on disciple making. Of all the things that we could choose to remember over the 2,000 years that there has been Christianity, we have somehow managed to all but forget the essential gospel mandate to make disciples of all nations. How have we effectively managed to purge this from our church practices? But the faintest traces of one of the most central purposes and practices of the original church is beyond me. It's fair to bet that to assume, it's a fair bet to assume that the overwhelming majority of Christians are not even aware of a call to discipleship or what it involves. And so this is something we have to work against. Discipleship is intrinsic to the life of the church and a central aspect of the church's mission in the world. Matter of fact, it says so right in Matthew 28:19 through 20. Its effective removal in the church's ministry must surely be a cause of much of the problems that we face. So how can we be possibly a church of Jesus Christ, or the church that Jesus intended for us to be, if we do not follow one of the most central aspects of Christ's practice, let alone obey his explicit command? This is a commandment that we must make disciples. This isn't a suggestion. This is not something that is reserved just for the lead pastor. Every single one of you, every single one of us has this on us. And when we leave that out, we have to ask ourselves, well, what is the purpose of church? Is the purpose of church just for us to come and feel good, to check some box of our cultural Christianity? Is it so that we can see our friends for the week, so that we can get a free cup of coffee and donuts? No, we must examine the real depth of why church is necessary. One of those reasons that I want to charge you with is the idea that church is necessary for the maturity of Christianity. I believe that most pastors sincerely want their members or want their participants to mature in their growth as believers and actually encourage it. And so believers must learn and practice. Matter of fact, the whole idea of being a disciple says that you are a student of Christ. And so growing in our spiritual disciplines, developing personal prayer, regular attendance to our worship services, regularly reading and studying the Bible, volunteering in our community, these practices always seem to have a feel of being an option or some extra thing that we must do. And that's just not the case. It's hard to find any average church in America offering much more than these things that I've listed, but there should be more than we are doing. And these tools, these things are not options. They are absolutely essential to our closeness with God. We will have to go beyond just church attendance. We have to go beyond just counting how many people are in the pews or how many bucks are in the plate. Quiet times and random volunteerism to help align the church around its purpose is necessary right now. Since we're not able to gather in the way that we always have been able to do, how can we best use this time to really jump into the ways in which we must continue to engage community for the cause of Christ? The church tends to lack a theology or practice of discipleship, and this is something that we must turn ourselves back towards. In many of our deepest problems, we can track a lack of discipleship. The non-discipleship of the church, then it is equally likely that a recovery of discipleship can signal significant renewal in the life of God's people. I have come to believe that almost all of the problems of the church we now face are linked here. And so a resurgence of this principle and these practices will be important. Matter of fact, call it getting back to the basics, reclaiming the Acts first church. We don't have to necessarily just start meeting at homes, although that's where we are now. We just have to be more committed to some of these basic Bible tenets. Transform the many churchy ways that we admire Jesus Christ and to our true following of Jesus Christ. Admirers of Jesus are hard to motivate and need to be constantly entertained. But only us as real followers of Jesus will go the distance to make a lasting impact on the world. So 2 questions that I want you to ponder. One is, what are the major problems that our church faces today? The second thing is, what if I told you that the single most paramount solution to any of those problems is discipleship? I would like for you to spend some time with your teams to actually analyze those issues and figure out how discipleship could potentially solve any one of those issues. I was just telling you earlier about this idea of making 1 million new disciples in a decade. What I'm calling that initiative is Multiplied Movement. And the reason that I'm calling it this is for a reason, a couple of different reasons. One is, I don't want you to hear the word movement as this like this major thing that a group of people are doing. What I'm talking about is actually moving. And what I'm recognizing is that even in the Great Commission, we are skipping over the most important word, one of the most important words in that passage, which is the word go. We are not going. We're doing a lot of staying, a lot of sitting, a lot of saying, hey, come to us. We're very attractional as a church, but we need to actually move towards being more missional. What makes for a highly transformative missional movement? Those kinds of movements that really get stuff done, that exhibit explosive growth and achieve high transformation and high societal impact. These are the things that we need to do and charge our ministries to be a part of. This is really important as we move forward because we are coming out of a season where we have been sitting for so long. I'm not talking about the pandemic right now. I'm talking about just the stagnation that has taken place because of the consumeristic way in which church has become. So now it's time to leave our churches. We've all left the building and actually go out and do some amazing things for God. I can say categorically that one of the most demonstrable, identifiable aspects, and therefore one of the most irreplaceable keys to this major movement is that we are obsessed with discipleship and obsessed with disciple making. That's right. I want your church to become obsessed with making disciples. It is factored in from the beginning to the end at every level of your organization, of your collective. Discipleship is so critical that it is the means by which Jesus works through all of his people. Matter of fact, he called his people disciples. Do you call your people members or disciples? I encourage you to change that. Start calling people disciples will actually start making them think about making more disciples rather than making more members. Not a short-term solution am I providing here. It's not a program. It's not some curriculum you need to go out and buy. The solution that will heal much of the malice and the mischievousness and the fittings that are happening within society actually can be solved in the church by helping people take more seriously and with more intention their role to follow Jesus and to be more like Jesus. I want to look at how discipleship applies to and makes a difference in relationship to evangelism. Evangelism has become one of these negative words, one of these bad words that the church says. And I'm not necessarily disengaged with the idea of proclaiming the gospel. I think that's super important even today. I think that the ideas or the ways in which we proclaim the gospel are now able to change. And so that's why I'm moving us from the idea of thinking about evangelism to the other E word of being external, externally focused, to be specific. Discipleship thinking can make a wholesale difference to our practices and our impact in the world when we think about our world not being so localized to the people on my pew or the people in my house, but we have an entire globe to conquer. So evangelism is not where it stops, but it is where it starts. And so we have to think about how evangelism, the role that evangelism plays, the role of proclamation that plays in the engine of making new disciples. I don't know which one is more important. I don't think that's important. I think what's important is that we recognize that they are interdependent of one another. So what if evangelism right now is actually blocking our capacity to get on with the real job of the church, which is mainly making disciples? In other words, more evangelism, the way we do it now, would not solve the problems, but actually might exacerbate them. And that's why we must change the idea, the paradigm of evangelism to something altogether different, and why I actually use the word externally focused instead. So making more disciples is the real solution. I suggest that we need to refocus our efforts on discipleship and do whatever evangelism we can do in that context. So hear me again, that we need to reframe evangelism within the context of discipleship. The overarching thing that we're doing is discipleship, and a part of that is the way that we execute evangelism. Let's see here. It's impossible to teach a man what he thinks he already knows. And so that is part of the issue with evangelism, is that sometimes when we engage people and we just invite them to our church, they may reject that because they say, I've been to church before, I know what that is, and it's something that I don't want to participate in. Or they may say, I have an idea of what Jesus is, and that's not something that I want to engage. When they already think they know, it's really hard to get them to think differently. So evangelism as a word becomes kind of an issue. We think we know what it is, so we have to change that idea. So for us, it is a settled formula embedded into a set of practices that are simply taken for granted, and that is something to consider, because what has gotten us here is not going to get us there. We're going to have to think very differently about our problems if we're going to resolve them. This is some unlearning that we need to do here if we are to advance the cause of Christ in our time. For instance, there was a time where we thought having church online is not real church. Well, now we have very quickly had to force ourselves to unlearn that idea, and we have found ways to transition into supplying the gospel to our parishioners in creative ways using technology. So reconsider the meaning and the significance of the Great Commission. The Great Commission, we tend to use it as this kind of synonym for the term evangelism. So in other words, the Great Commission, to be a Great Commission church is to understand what it is to be evangelistic church. And so this understanding has become popular in a lot of evangelical circles, and not to say that it's completely wrong, but it perpetuates the church growth movement. And I suggest that we use the Great Commission as a synonym for evangelism, that using this as a synonym for evangelism could be a categorical error that simply provides some points in knowing that we actually are working against our ability to help people to explore rethinking. So we want to maybe pull away from some of that ways of thinking. Again, the growth movement is now undergoing a serious self-assessment and reevaluation. We're good at getting decisions for Christ, but not so good at making disciples. So the ability to emotionalize a moment, to get people to walk down the aisle and devote themselves to a church, we've got that down. But do we have the ability to help them to understand how to involve themselves in a disciple-making process? So I commend this unlearning and this repentance, because by and large, the evangelism of the greater church movement cater to the very thing we need to work against in our time, which is consumerism. So we cannot continue to do that. Matter of fact, I would wonder if some of the ways in which you perpetuated or transitioned our churches to just giving church online still is consumerism. If you are doing that, what I encourage is that you help to find ways to move from people just consuming your church service to actually being engaged in your church community. Anyone coming to Jesus in America comes as an already well-informed consumer a lot of times. There are very few Americans who have heard of Jesus and think they already know who Jesus is. And so we must really kind of work with that at the core, because consumerism takes all of the forms of an idolatrous religion into play. When we go to a shopping mall, they want us to buy things and fill our basic needs. And they are looking for, they're not looking for purpose or significance or belonging in a shopping mall. They just want you to come, buy what you need, and then leave. Do we want our churches to be this way? The average shopping trip turns into a serious exercise in spirituality, and the average trip to the church turns into an extensive exercise in religious consumerism. So now when people want therapy or want to gain some sense of God's self, they go to the mall, and they call that retail therapy. But we want people to be able to see Christ as a major resource for the things that they may be dealing with in their life, and as a way to greater connect with God. Prevailing methods of evangelism have been seriously co-opted to consumerism, and this is something we must be willing to walk away from. The only way to challenge the insidiously idolatrous nature of consumerism is through becoming more and more and more and more like Jesus. In other words, discipleship. If our Lord says discipleship is the core to our mission according to the Great Commission, then we have no right to remove it. Now, this does mean that we must stop sharing the good news far from in the way that we maybe thought that we should, or that we did in the past. But here's the deal. Evangelism gets done along the way as you go. Matter of fact, there's a translation of the Great Commission that doesn't just say go and make disciples, but it says as you go, make disciples. As you disciple the nations, evangelism takes place because it's done in its proper context, which is discipleship. Discipleship should start even before people become regenerated or become born again or converted, if you believe in that particular theology. Continues right until the end, and disciplism is done along the way. That means that Disciplism isn't just about coming to church or attending church or being a part of the church functions or small group. That when you are in the grocery store, you are making disciples. When you are at your job or at your workplace, your commission is still to make disciples. When you tuck your children into bed at night, you are still making disciples. When you walk down the aisle of matrimony, that is a process towards making disciples. And when you are just casually on your jog in the morning, connecting with God, find ways to make disciples. When we were disciples of Jesus Christ, born again, we thought about this being the beginning, the end of a process. Like, I'm Christian now. And what I'm saying to you, continue to be Christian, continue to believe in Christ, but now it's time to actually do what Christ has told us to do, which is this notion of being involved in discipleship. If you look at what Jesus is doing, he's got a whole lot of pre-conversion disciples, per se. None of the disciples had yet joined the church of Christ. That didn't exist quite yet. Didn't exist until Christ left, matter of fact. Tagging along with him. All the while, he just discipling them along the way until the gospel narrative finally weaved its way into the hearts of the people that they encountered. They are actually involved in his ministry even before they were fully converted over. And that's what I want to encourage you to do. Get people involved, get the community involved in what's happening with your church, what's happening with your life. And as you're living life with people, introduce them to Christ along the way. It will make for a much better experience for them and also for you. I want to read to you a quote from C.S. Lewis out of his writings called Mere Christianity. It's easy to think that the church has a lot of different objectives: education, buildings, missions, holding services. The church exists for nothing else but to draw men into Christ, to make them little Christs. If they are not doing that, all the cathedrals, clergy, missions, sermons, even the Bible itself are simply a waste of time. God becomes man for no other purpose. It is even doubtful, whether the whole universe was created for any other purpose. It says in the Bible that the whole universe was made for Christ and that everything in it is to be gathered together in him. The church that takes discipleship seriously is the church that takes Jesus and the gospel seriously. The church that neglects this non-negotiable aspect of the New Testament faith misses the point entirely, and dangerously so. The point, the significance of discipleship, the reframing of your understanding in practical evangelism, the ongoing engaging with the living Jesus Christ amidst is probably the most important reason why we should make an inevitably prioritized purpose towards disciple making. Disciple making lies at the core of the church's mission. It's not an option, it's not an extra, it's not a program, an add-on. Discipleship is adherence to Jesus and the process by which we are formed in Jesus. Discipleship is a lifelong encounter and the privilege of those called to follow Jesus as God. Beloved, please hear me reproclaiming this very important commission that has been set before us. We must make more disciples. If you or your congregation is interested in cooperating with New Church Ministry towards that, if you know someone who wants to start a church, please send them my way. Have them get in touch with the regional minister. If your congregation wants to explore this idea of how to be more of a disciple making engine, I'd love to converse with you about that. Again, email me at info@newchurchministry.org. We'd love to set up some time to walk your congregation in a discovery, in a discernment towards being more externally focused and more a part of the call towards making new disciples. Thank you again, beloved, for your time today, and I welcome any and all inquiries and questions about this opportunity to make disciples. God bless you.